There's a kind of success that doesn't feel like ambition. It feels like survival. You know it when you see it. People who work like their lives depend on it, who stack achievements not out of joy, but out of necessity. They're not chasing dreams, they're building walls. And behind those walls, what they're really trying to protect is a fragile sense of safety. Today we're diving into a psychological reality that most never question, that for many high-functioning adults, the drive to succeed isn't about purpose, it's about protection. Not from failure, but from a deeper threat, the return of a helplessness they swore they'd never feel again. Let's be clear, this isn't lazily labeling people as trauma survivors or reducing every achievement to pathology. This is about confronting the reality that emotional development doesn't happen in a vacuum. And for those whose early environments were unstable, whether emotionally, financially, or relationally, success becomes more than just a goal. It becomes a life strategy. So here's the core conflict. If a child learns that love, attention, or basic needs are conditional, based on performance, obedience, or invisibility, what happens when that child becomes an adult? They don't stop performing. They just raise the stakes. The workplace becomes the new arena. Promotions, credentials, and salary become proxies for safety. And every new goalpost is secretly tied to the hope that this time, maybe, they'll feel secure. But here's the problem. Success earned from fear doesn't end in peace. It ends in exhaustion. So what's really going on beneath the surface? At the psychological level, this pattern often begins with the construction of the false self, a term rooted in developmental psychology, especially in the work of Donald Winnicott. The false self emerges in childhood as a protective adaptation. When the real self, full of needs, emotions, and vulnerability, proves to be too risky to express in a given environment, the child learns to suppress it, and instead they construct a version of themselves that is acceptable, competent, and high-performing. That's the false self. This isn't faking, it's surviving. And as adults, they don't know they've split. They just think, if I'm not achieving, I'm not safe. The link between self-worth and performance becomes fused, and worse, it becomes invisible. Now, think about how this plays out over time. In childhood, the logic is simple. If I make no mistakes, maybe they won't get angry. In adulthood, it morphs into, if I just get that next promotion, maybe I'll finally breathe. But they never do. Because the fear isn't about the job. It's about the self. It's about a part of them that still believes the world is unsafe unless they're proving their value at all times. And until that internal contract is challenged, no amount of money, status, or power will ever be enough. This is why success can become addictive, but never fulfilling. Because the root drive isn't positive vision, it's avoidance. It's the unconscious attempt to escape a psychological wound often left untouched for decades. And here's the hard truth. The deeper that wound, the more convincing the false self becomes, because it has to be. Vulnerability gets replaced with control, authenticity with performance, rest with hypervigilance. And in professional culture, this behavior often gets rewarded, celebrated even. But inside, there's a quiet crisis, a constant fear of collapse. Not because the system is unsustainable, but because the identity built on success is brittle. One missed target, one rejection, one not good enough, and the emotional floor threatens to disappear. This isn't about being weak. It's about carrying a survival strategy that was never meant to be permanent. And if we never question the origin of our drive, why we need to succeed just to feel safe, we risk spending our lives building a fortress that protects nothing but our own silence. So here's the starting point. If you can't rest without guilt, if your value feels tied to your output, if success feels like armor instead of expression, you might not be chasing success. You might just be running from vulnerability. And that's not ambition. That's a wound. In the next part, we'll expose how these survival patterns are shaped in childhood and why the emotional insecurity we refuse to acknowledge is often the very force directing our adult lives. What if the very behaviors we call hard work, driven, or high achieving are really symptoms, not of motivation, but of fear? And not fear of failure, fear of emotional exposure. To understand the psychological blueprint behind this, we have to go backward, not in years, but in emotional time. Because for many people, the urge to overachieve doesn't begin in adulthood. It begins in a childhood defined by emotional instability. Picture a child who never quite knows what version of a parent is going to show up. Sometimes warm, sometimes cold, sometimes proud, sometimes punishing. That child becomes hyper-attuned to approval. Their nervous system learns to scan constantly for cues of safety or threat, and they discover early that performance, being helpful, being impressive, being perfect, can delay the chaos. This is the beginning of overcompensation. The subconscious mind draws a conclusion. If I'm exceptional, I can stay safe. That belief becomes the foundation of their identity. And once it sets in, it rarely gets questioned because it works, at least on the surface. They get good grades, they impress adults, they're praised for their potential, and everyone thinks they're thriving, but they're not. They're surviving. This is what makes it so dangerous. Overcompensation gets rewarded by teachers, by bosses, by society. But inside, it disconnects the person from their emotional reality. So what exactly is overcompensation? It's the psychological mechanism where we respond to deep internal insecurity by projecting exaggerated strength. It's not confidence, it's armor. And like all armor, it's heavy. It restricts movement. It separates the wearer from real connection. A child who feels not enough may grow into an adult who needs to prove they're more than enough in every room, on every stage, with every title. But the proving never ends because the original wound, the belief in inadequacy, remains unhealed. Now let's bring in another psychological layer, the inferiority complex. This isn't about low self-esteem in the casual sense. It's about a core, often unconscious belief that one is inherently flawed. And instead of accepting that belief, the mind builds a compensatory strategy to become superior in some way. Smarter, richer, more accomplished, more respected. But here's the paradox. No matter how much success is accumulated, the inner void remains untouched. Because success can decorate insecurity, but it cannot resolve it. This is where the modern hustle culture becomes particularly deceptive. It gives language to the behavior, grind, hustle, no days off, but not to the pain driving it. So the person doesn't heal. They perform. They achieve, but they never feel safe. Let's be clear again. This isn't an attack on ambition. Ambition rooted in vision is powerful. But ambition rooted in fear is a prison, and it's a quiet one, because on the outside, everything looks fine. Only the person living inside the armor knows how much of it is held together by anxiety. So let's ask the deeper question: where does this fear come from? It often originates in environments where a child's emotional needs were minimized, ignored, or punished. When a child learns that love is conditional, or that safety depends on their ability to meet adult expectations, they stop developing a secure sense of self, and instead, they build one that's strategic. They don't ask, "What do I want?" They ask, "What do I need to be so I don't get hurt?" This is the core fracture that overcompensation tries to cover, and it becomes the lens through which all success is filtered. Even when they reach their goals, there's no celebration. Just the next task, the next validation, the next thing to chase. Because slowing down might mean feeling something they've spent years avoiding: unworthiness. This is the hidden cost of a life spent running from insecurity. Not just burnout, not just exhaustion, but disconnection from the self. When success becomes an escape, we lose contact with the inner voice that once knew what safety actually felt like. And that loss is devastating because it means we don't know when to stop. We don't know what enough feels like. And we don't trust that we'd still be valuable even if we did nothing. So the chase continues, not because we love the game, but because we're terrified of what silence might reveal. In the next part, we'll confront the psychological role of control, why perfectionism and overplanning aren't signs of confidence, but often symptoms of an internal collapse waiting to happen. Control is often mistaken for confidence. But in psychological terms, control, especially the obsessive kind, is not a sign of strength. It's a symptom of fear. A subtle, deeply ingrained fear that if we loosen our grip for even a moment, everything will fall apart, including us. For those who chase success as a means to feel safe, control becomes the currency of survival. They micromanage, they overplan, they anticipate every possible failure before it happens. And they don't call it fear, they call it preparation. But beneath this calculated exterior is a nervous system that doesn't trust the world or themselves to hold steady without constant supervision. Let's call it what it is. Perfectionism is not a preference, it's a defense mechanism. It's the mind saying, if I can control every variable, I can avoid shame, I can avoid rejection, I can avoid collapse. Now, collapse doesn't always mean losing a job, a home, or a relationship. For many high-functioning adults, collapse means emotional exposure. It means being seen as vulnerable, or worse, insufficient. So perfectionism then is a form of emotional armor. And like all armor, it keeps danger out, but it also keeps connection out. Where does this start? In early life, when a child learns, implicitly or explicitly, that mistakes are dangerous. Maybe they were punished harshly. Maybe they were praised only when they excelled. Maybe they were invisible unless they performed. Whatever the form, the message is the same. Love, attention, or safety is conditional. So the child adapts. They stop experimenting. They stop asking for help. They try to be flawless. And this adaptation doesn't go away with age. It evolves. It becomes achievement. It becomes hyper-discipline. It becomes perfectionism disguised as professionalism. But it's not about excellence. It's about safety. And here's the cost. The perfectionist is never present. Their mind is always in the next step, the next move, the next correction, because to be present would mean to be vulnerable, to trust, to let go. And that, to the traumatized mind, feels life-threatening. This is where we must introduce the concept of the inner critic. The inner critic is the internalized voice of early judgment. It's the mental echo of authority figures, parents, teachers, caregivers, who conveyed that love must be earned and failure is a flaw of character. For the perfectionist adult, this voice becomes constant background noise. You should have done more. You're still behind. You can't relax now. And worst of all, if you fail, it means something about who you are. This voice doesn't push them forward, it drives them. Not with inspiration, but with anxiety. And the mistake most people make is thinking this voice is motivating. In truth, it's a psychological leash. And the more we obey it, the more we lose contact with any sense of inner worth that isn't tied to performance. Let's pause here. Think of the cost of living this way. Every success is hollow because it doesn't quiet the voice. Every rest feels like a risk because it invites judgment. And every imperfection is magnified as evidence of internal failure. Eventually, the person begins to measure their entire worth by what they can control. And because control is impossible to perfect, their sense of self becomes perpetually unstable. This is the paradox of control. The more we try to master everything, the less secure we feel. Because security built on perfection is inherently fragile. Here's the deeper truth. Control is an illusion. Life is inherently uncertain. People are unpredictable. The self is dynamic. Trying to force stability through success, through perfection, through hyper-control, only reinforces the underlying belief that we are not safe as we are. That we must earn peace, earn rest, earn love. But what if that belief is the real problem? Because a mind convinced it must control everything to survive will never learn to trust even itself. In high-achieving environments, this mindset is often misread as dedication. But underneath, there's emotional exhaustion, a collapsing sense of identity, and an invisible war between the false self and the parts that are terrified of ever being seen as less than. This is why perfectionists burn out. Not because they can't handle stress, but because they never allow themselves to be human. And humanity, flawed, emotional, spontaneous, is exactly what they were trained to suppress. So what happens when they succeed? They don't feel relief. They feel exposed because the higher they climb, the more they fear falling. The stakes rise, the pressure tightens, and the inner critic grows louder, until eventually control becomes the only thing keeping the identity intact. In the next part, we'll examine the emotional consequences of this lifestyle, how the pursuit of success, when used to avoid vulnerability, slowly disconnects us from our own feelings and relationships, leaving behind a hollow version of safety.
When success becomes the shield, emotion becomes the casualty. Over time, those who chase achievement to feel safe begin to disconnect, not just from others, but from themselves. The cost isn't obvious at first. It hides behind full calendars, constant movement, polished answers. But beneath the performance is a subtle and devastating fracture: emotional detachment. And make no mistake, this detachment isn't laziness. It's not apathy. It's a defense. It's what happens when the nervous system concludes that feeling is dangerous. When the body decides that emotional exposure, grief, sadness, fear, even joy can't be trusted. So it shuts down. Not because it's broken, but because it's trying to protect what's left. For many adults locked in the cycle of success as safety, this emotional suppression becomes their default state. They don't cry, they don't pause, they don't admit pain. Instead, they intellectualize, rationalize, move on. Because stillness means confrontation. And confrontation means opening doors they've spent decades bolting shut. But the problem is, those feelings don't disappear. Suppressed emotion doesn't die. It festers. It reroutes. It becomes physical tension, chronic fatigue, unexplained anger, or a persistent sense of emptiness that no success ever seems to fill. This is where the psychological defense mechanisms become especially costly. Repression, dissociation, numbing. All strategies the psyche employs to preserve functioning when emotional pain becomes too overwhelming. But when these strategies become permanent, the person doesn't just lose access to pain, they lose access to life. Because you can't selectively numb emotion. When you shut down sadness, you also mute joy. When you suppress fear, you dilute wonder. When you avoid vulnerability, you block intimacy. And what's left is a life that looks impressive from the outside, but feels hollow on the inside. Let's dig deeper. Emotional detachment is often a sign of complex trauma, not necessarily catastrophic events, but long-term emotional neglect, unpredictable caregiving, or environments where vulnerability was punished. These experiences train the nervous system to view feeling as threat and safety as something external, something earned through output, status, or control. So what does this adult look like? They're composed, efficient, and in control. They rarely appear overwhelmed. They don't talk about their needs because they've trained themselves not to have any. But inside, they're starving for connection, for rest, for permission to feel without judgment. Yet, they don't know how. Or worse, they don't believe they're allowed. And this belief is rarely challenged because success masks dysfunction. Colleagues admire their work ethic. Supervisors praise their discipline. Friends describe them as strong. No one sees the cost. They don't notice the nights spent working long past the point of exhaustion, not out of passion, but because rest feels unsafe. They don't hear the internal monologue that turns every shortcoming into a moral failure. They don't feel the silence where emotion should be, because that silence has become normal. This is emotional isolation in its most sophisticated form. Not dramatic, not destructive, just chronically disconnected. Here's the paradox. The very strategies that once kept them safe are now the ones keeping them numb. The success that promised freedom becomes the structure of their prison, and the emotional detachment that once protected them now prevents them from living. So where do we go from here? Not toward more success, not toward more control, but inward, toward the parts of the self that were silenced in the name of survival, toward the emotions that were buried to protect the image, toward the inner child who learned too early that feeling was a liability. Because until we reconnect with those parts, no amount of achievement will be enough. We'll keep performing, keep producing, keep perfecting, but we won't feel anything. And that's the most dangerous outcome of all. Not failure, but emotional death. In the final part, we'll shift towards psychological integration. We'll explore how to redefine safety, not as something earned, but as something built from within, and why reclaiming our emotions is the first step to redefining what it truly means to succeed.
What happens when you finally get everything you worked for? Status, recognition, security, and you still don't feel safe? What happens when success no longer quiets the fear, the shame, the hollowness you spent your life running from? The truth hits hard. It was never about the success, because safety that has to be earned was never real to begin with. What you were chasing wasn't a goal, it was relief. Relief from the chaos, from the uncertainty, from the fear that you are not enough unless you're exceptional. But that fear doesn't disappear when you succeed. It just hides in more expensive clothes, louder praise, higher stakes. Eventually, the game collapses, not because you failed, but because the strategy itself was never sustainable. So what now? Now we confront the part of ourselves we've avoided, the vulnerable self, the one buried under performance, the one silenced by shame, the one who never got to believe they were safe unless they proved it every day. This is where real change begins, not with more effort, but with integration. Integration means turning toward the parts of ourselves that were exiled, the fear, the grief, the unmet needs, and bringing them back into the whole, not to fix them, but to stop pretending they're not part of us. Because the only thing more exhausting than fear is hiding from it. And here's the paradox. The parts of you that you've rejected, minimized, and outperformed are not your weaknesses. They are the gateway to real safety. Not the kind built from credentials or control, but the kind that grows when your nervous system learns to rest in your own presence. This is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole. Not perfect, not impressive, whole. It's not about rejecting success. It's about detaching your identity from it. Because when your sense of self is fused with performance, every mistake becomes an existential threat. But when you begin to see yourself as more than your output, success becomes optional, not compulsive. That's real freedom. And to get there, you must do what the achiever self fears most. Slow down, feel, listen, grieve, let go. This isn't weakness, it's reclamation. You reclaim the right to rest, the right to feel uncertain without panic, the right to exist without justifying your worth. And in doing so, you begin to redefine success, not as something to chase, but as something to align with. Not as a measure of value, but as a reflection of inner coherence. This is the quiet revolution, not in your schedule, in your psyche. Because once you no longer need success to feel safe, you're free to choose it from clarity, not compulsion. You're free to say no to what once enslaved you. You're free to define your life beyond the narrative of performance. And most importantly, you're free to feel, fully, honestly, and unapologetically. That's not the end of the journey, but it's the end of the chase. And for the first time,
you're not running, you're arriving. Thank you for listening. We'll continue again when you're ready to go deeper.